New chapter today. We are on to Unit 9, which is largely World War II and a little bit of the birth of the Cold War. And obviously, things might change a little bit as we kind of find out what no school looks like and for how long that goes. But for right now, this should be about 2 weeks. And if it goes longer, then it goes longer and we can go into more depth because we're not going to be around each other as much to talk. But I do encourage you guys, as always, leave questions in the comments if you need me to clarify anything. And also, starting on probably Monday or Tuesday, I'm going to start putting up just like a weekly discussion board thing on our Google Classroom. So if you guys want to talk over anything or, just talk, you can do that. So let's get started with World War II. Woohoo! Okay. So this one is pretty brief for your deep note-taking purposes unless you are super duper into this stuff, but you need the background information on this, otherwise it makes not a lick of sense. So this is more background information. If you hear noise in the background, I apologize. My dog is very excited about me talking about World War II. Okay, so we sort of alluded to this at the end of the last chapter, actually, with Joseph Stalin making the agreement with Hitler in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to basically split Poland. So September 1939, this is basically when we say that World War II officially begins. The Nazis invade Poland, the USSR, the Russians allow it to happen, and the rest of the world just sort of stops and is horrified by this, as Poland has been a country that has been beaten up for decades, really, if not centuries, by the rest of Europe. They finally had their own country, and in rolls Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to take it all away from them. They're immediately going to start rounding up people of Jewish descent, homosexuals, the disabled. Who else am I missing out on here? Gypsies, the Romani people. They're all rounded up, and they will start to be put into camps. We're not talking straight up concentration camps yet, but that will be happening very, very soon. We will get back to concentration camps when we get into like 1945-ish. But just be aware that the entire time this war is going on and all of this fighting is happening and everything that's happening with America, bad things are happening to the Jewish minority and to those other groups of people I talked about in Europe. And by 1943, we're going to start seeing tons and tons of executions happening. So just sort of let that sit in the back of your mind as we go through all of this. England and France are preparing for war. They don't believe Hitler, as I said in the last chapter. Neville Chamberlain appeasing Hitler, giving him that part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, was essentially if you give a mouse a cookie. Neville Chamberlain gave Adolf Hitler a cookie, and as you all know, once you give a mouse a cookie, then he's going to want some milk, or in the case of Hitler, he's going to want to take over the rest of Europe. That sounds glib. That is the best way to describe what happens in Europe leading up to World War II. France thinks it's going to be okay. So right here on sort of the northern border to the western border, the eastern border of France is what was called the Maginot Line. After World War I had happened, France decided it was never going to be invaded again and built a series of interlocking forts. Not like Legos, they were connected by underground tunnels, but these were large, basically concrete bunkers with guns pointing out of them. And so if anybody would ever try to invade France again, these guns would just blow them away. Two problems here. One, the guns in those bunkers could not really traverse, which means they could not move laterally from side to side very well. And also, they did not build the Maginot Line up here in their border with Belgium. You think they would have learned last time when the Germans literally did this and just went around and came in through Belgium? Remember, that's the reason a bunch of countries joined World War I. Anyway, this exact same thing is going to happen again. The German forces are going to use what is called Blitzkrieg, which translates to lightning war, to rapidly defeat the UK and the French troops. Basically, this is what Blitzkrieg looks like in a picture, obviously. These Germans load up every armored vehicle they have with troops, gas, and ammo, and they just charge past the French. So these static formations, these forts that aren't moving, they just drive past them super fast, and before the French realize what's happening, the Germans are already past them. So what they do is they keep pushing forward, and they leave the sort of next wave of German troops to come in and just basically capture the French who are just sitting there getting blown past. This is going to work incredibly well basically what's going to happen, and this is a different map we'll explain in a second, the Germans push the French and the English back to sort of this area right here, the English Channel. And this is what that movie Dunkirk was about a couple years ago. No, you can't do it for your movie. It has nothing to do with the United States. In June 1940, there is basically a little pocket in northern France held by the British Expeditionary Force, which is what they call their military. I apologize for that noise, as does my dog. And some French troops as well. And what's going to happen, if you haven't seen the movie, is over 300,000 troops are going to be saved by the Nazis, by the British sending out basically every single ship that they can find, from a little fishing boat to massive troop transports. And over the better part of a couple of weeks, they are going to get most of the troops out of Europe. England is basically the last bastion of non-Nazi controlled Europe. The Russians are on one side, not doing anything, kind of letting Hitler do whatever he wants as long as he stays out of their business. And the English are trapped on, the British Isles across the English Channel at this point. The French government is largely going to surrender, and that's what this map is. The Marshal Pétain, the guy who basically saved France's bacon in World War I, is going to surrender to the Nazis to hopefully, in his mind, make things better for France. It's not going to be better. And so what happens is the French that are cool, quote unquote, with the Nazis, they don't love the Nazis, but they're willing to deal with them, go down here into what's called Vichy France. And this entire area up here, all of the coastline, is going to be German occupied. So think of this as almost like a giant military camp up here. And Benito Mussolini, we remember him from last time, the leader of Italy, gets this little slice of France right here, basically from Hitler, in thanks for, being a fascist along with Hitler. So England is desperate for supplies. They do not have a lot of raw material there, much like Japan. They need to import stuff. So they start asking America for help. And in early 1939, old Franklin Roosevelt is like, oh boy, I really hate those Nazis, but we're supposed to be remaining neutral here. We're just climbing out of that second recession we wrapped up the last chapter with, and we really don't want to get involved. But here's what he says. He says, hey, Winston Churchill, who is the new Prime Minister of England, we'll talk about him more later, we want to help you out, and we realize you don't have money, so we're going to institute a policy called Lend-Lease, and you need to know this. That is why I put it specifically on your notes. And what Lend-Lease is going to do is the U.S. is going to sell military supplies and basically anything else England needs on credit. Franklin Roosevelt describes this as if your neighbor's house is on fire, you're not going to charge him to borrow your hose. That's the rationale behind this, is England has been the U.S.'s number one ally really since the War of 1812 ended, and we realized that we were way more similar than we were different, and we don't want to see England go down to the Nazis. So we're going to do everything we can to sell them everything. Technically, we're neutral, but we're not really neutral at this point. We've more or less cast in our lot with the British. Most of America is okay with this, in no small part because this is creating a massive amount of jobs. So when we asked you that question last time and that you answered on Friday, hey, what's the deal with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal? Did it work? And you probably said sort of. The reason you said sort of is we didn't get completely out of the Great Depression. Lend-Lease is going to start to finally bring us all the way out of the Great Depression. And it is going to help America when we get dragged into the war in 1941 at the very end to gear up to supply all of our soldiers and create a massive amount of stuff. So Lend-Lease is the start of that. Lend-Lease is giving the British basically supplies on credit with the promise that they'll pay us back later as long as they're fighting the Nazis. What the British are involved with at this point is they're not fighting on land, they're fighting in the air. The Battle of Britain is going to take place over roughly 6 months in the summer into fall of 1940. The Germans are bombing British cities and British manufacturing. They're not very good at it, though, which is a miracle. They tend to not hit what are new creations called radar that allow the British to see incoming planes coming in and scramble their own planes to fight against them. The German Luftwaffe is their air force, and this time is called the Blitz by the English because they were rapidly coming in, bombing cities. London is repeatedly bombed. Thousands of citizens are going to die, but the English push forward and continue to fight. Eventually, the English are going to get their Air Force, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, to hold out, and by mid to late October 1940, they will have essentially defeated the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe aren't aggressive enough, and the British take advantage of this, and their superior pilots end up basically taking out the Luftwaffe's ability to be an offensive force. They're still a defensive force. It's still not easy to fly in to Europe to attack German bases, but the Germans are not coming out and attacking the British anymore. So, good for the British. They've got a little control, and they also are getting a whole bunch of bullets and other necessary stuff shipped to them by the U.S. Now, how does the U.S. get involved in the war? Simply put, it's Pearl Harbor. This here, of course, is a picture taken during Pearl Harbor. This video in the top right-hand corner, you will have your own assignment. It goes out on Monday, and you guys are going to watch this and answer a couple questions about it in a comment thread. So, you can watch it now if you want. As I said last time, am not one for watching a YouTube video in a YouTube video. That's a little inception-y. So there will be a link up on Classroom. You can watch it there. Let's move forward. So the U.S. is really going to try its hardest to stay out of the war all through 1939 and 1940. Lend-Lease is obviously a thing. We start to hear about Hitler rounding up the Jews and putting them into camps or ghettos. And America really doesn't want to take a stand on this, despite the fact that we know it's pretty horrible. The worst example of this is a ship called the St. Louis that's filled with about 900 Jewish refugees. Initially, Hitler's plan was to kind of boot the Jews out of his Reich, his area of control, which was most of Europe at this point, and just steal all their stuff. But they didn't really have anywhere to go, so they get to Spain. These 900 Jews, they eventually get on a ship, and they come over to the U.S., and the U.S. won't let them in. They basically say, nope, remember the Quota Act? We've hit our quota for the year. Get out. And so for weeks, they sort of putter around the Caribbean, and eventually are forced to go back to Europe, and the vast majority of them end up being killed in concentration camps. The only real, there is no upside to that. On the other side, across the continent, I guess, in the other ocean, in the Pacific, the U.S. is in the process of cutting down on material sales to Japan. We are no longer going to sell Japan scrap metal, which they desperately need, and we're no longer going to sell them oil. And because we're not going to sell them oil, Japan is going to see us as trying to cut them off, and they are going to start moving further down into the Pacific, into like the Indonesia area, to try to get rubber and fuel for their own war machine that has been fighting in China for the last couple of years. Remember the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere? This is part of that operation. Back in Europe, Hitler and Mussolini continue to consolidate power. The vast majority of Europe is now controlled by Hitler or by Hitler's allies. General Franco in Spain and Mussolini in Italy, or by puppet states. So like the Vichy in France, the Quislings in Norway, you name a country, it is either controlled by Germany or remotely controlled by Germany if that country is not Switzerland, which was taking Nazi gold at the time, or it's the UK. It's rough. So Franklin Roosevelt and Congress in this time pass a law. I realize that's cut off, but you can deal with it and it'll be fixed on your slides. Franklin Roosevelt and Congress sort of see the writing on the wall by 1941 here, early 1941. So they were smart enough to, about a year before, had passed a law that said, if you are drafted into the U.S. military, you're going to need to serve longer. It used to just be like 6 months or 10 months or something, and now it's a year or two that you're going to need to serve. So Congress and Franklin Roosevelt are aware of the fact that the military is soon going to become a necessity and are starting to gear up for that. Just to sort of put this in context for you, Down here, we've got 189,000 men in the U.S. Army in 1939. By the time we get to 1945, the end of the war, we're going to have 8.2 million. That number, as you can see, is going to rise in the Navy and Marines as well. There's no Air Force there because the Air Force did not currently exist. Excuse me. So, the war, in many a historian's perspective, turns in 1941. And it's a 1-2 punch of incredibly stupid decisions by the Axis powers. The Axis, of course, being Germany, Italy, and Japan. First off, Hitler makes the first stupid step. He enacts what is called Operation Barbarossa, which is this map right here. And the point of Operation Barbarossa is to invade Russia. Hitler hates Stalin, Stalin hates Hitler, and Hitler wants to absolutely wipe out the Russians and then move his superior Aryan people into the newly created Lebensraum, the living space of Russia, and take all of that over. It's going to work like gangbusters for a couple of months here, and then it is going to absolutely destroy any hopes Hitler had of being successful. The Germans are going to commit a multitude of war crimes. They're going to murder entire villages. Anything horrible that you can think of, the Germans probably do it in the midst of Operation Barbarossa. Stalin is completely shocked by this. Stalin is double shocked because Hitler's spies had convinced him that a number of his best generals were, in fact, German agents, and so Stalin had them either executed or thrown into prison camps. One of the guys who will come in at Stalingrad, which we'll talk about a little bit later, General Zhukov, had most of his teeth ripped out by his buddies in the Russian intelligence service. So it's a bad time in Russia right now. But as we will see, this is a massive mistake. So Hitler's mistake is invading Russia in 1941. A couple months later, the Japanese are going to make an equally catastrophic mistake. On December 7th, 1941, I will make you know that date, don't test me, we have Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is the U.S.'s main naval base in the Pacific. It's in the Hawaiian Islands, and it's attacked by the Japanese without warning. There will be a whole bunch more information in that Day of Infamy speech, which I talked about at the beginning of this slide, this one right up here. Watch that. It'll go into way more detail and probably be more brief than I would be. But long story short, good news, bad news. Good news, the American aircraft carriers are gone. They're not at Hawaii at the time. They're out on maneuvers, and so the Japanese cannot attack them, which is a blessing. Downside, America is going to lose 4 battleships. 4 more are going to be heavily damaged, and we're going to have just shy of 2,000 members of the military killed and another 1,500 gravely injured by this attack. Japan does this as basically a preemptive strike against the U.S. They believe that we're going to enter the war sooner or later, so they don't want us to have any power in the Pacific whatsoever. It's not a particularly well-advised attack, but it's incredibly, incredibly effective. Some people always bring up the story as, hey, did the president know that this was going to happen? Did he allow Pearl Harbor to happen to sucker the U.S. into World War II and to get us to start fighting already? And the answer is no, not really. We knew something was going to happen. We didn't have specifics, and the code hadn't been broken yet. As we'll see when we move further into the chapter, we will eventually break the Japanese code, and things will go much better for the U.S. Navy moving forward. But as it stands during Pearl Harbor, we had a vague idea something was going to happen. We didn't know the date, and Franklin Roosevelt certainly did not just quote-unquote allow it to happen. December 8th, 1941. Franklin Roosevelt is going to speak to Congress. We are going to declare war against Japan. And this is sort of the 1-2 punch of this part being very, very stupid. We didn't declare war against Germany. But because Germany was allied with Japan, Germany was duty-bound to declare war on us. They also didn't like the fact that we were helping out the British. So, basically, by the end of 1941, America has entered World War II on both fronts. We have a country to fight in Japan in the Pacific theater, and we have a country to fight in Germany and Italy in the Atlantic theater. The U.S. is just going to start gearing up for war right now. I mean, as you can see right here, we've increased our numbers quite dramatically already into the military, but a lot of that is people rushing to sign up in the last few weeks of 1941 to join the military. Our military will not be ready to fight for, conservatively, another year, especially the Army. The Marines are a little more ready to go, and we will talk about all of that next time. So remember, any questions, put them online, and make sure you watch that Day of Infamy speech and leave your comments there. All right, folks, have a good one.